Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. I'm not going to go through a whole litany of greetings in the interest of time. It's a great honor to be here in Sri Lanka for this impressive event. It's the third time I've been invited, and it's the third time I've come over to Sri Lanka in about 10 years. First of all, the views that I'm going to be expressing here are my own. I know I'm not a government functionary anymore in the US, and I live in Singapore right now, so it's a sensitive issue what I'm going to be talking about, and this does not represent the views of Singapore government or my university, Nanyang Technological University. The presentation that I'm doing here today on Daesh, its way of warfare, is actually part of a project that I'm looking at the ways of warfare. And I'll explain that when I get through the slides, of different, what I call super empowered insurgency or revolutionary movements / terrorist groups, ranging from the FARC, LTTE, Hezbollah, Taliban, and IS. So basically, this is a project that I'm doing for the government over there. It's essentially non-state actors. I'm also doing, in the interest of providing some contrast, I'm also doing another project. I just came back from Australian War College, where I presented a paper on Asian military capabilities ranging from the Middle East right through the Far East. I view myself as a generalist on global South military capabilities. And I stole the title from a well-known Singaporean intellectual, Kishore Mahbubani, who wrote a book called Can Asians Fight? So I titled my talk with no little controversy, Can Asians Fight? And basically, the analysis has to do with, can they do joint warfare? And while the jury's out, the verdict doesn't look very good. Okay, I'll give you a bit of context. Most of us know about Daesh, the so-called caliphate, when it caught the world's attention as a victorious non-state actor between 2014 and 15, and its sudden defeats in 2017 and 2018. I don't think it's fully defeated. I think it's going to come back. It's one of those intergenerational things. Now, a lot, as you all know, has been written about Daesh by various academics, policymakers, journalists around the world. Most of the stuff, which some of it is very good, some of it is really execrable, most of it deals with its ideology, which is a very fascinating topic. Its terror tactics, finances, organization, and state-building enterprises in Raqqa and Mosul. Unfortunately, very little has been written on its military capabilities and the evolution of these military capabilities from day one, which I call the days of the Abu Musab al-Zarqawi network, through Al-Qaeda in Iraq, to IS, to ISI, which is Islamic State in Iraq, then to IS from 2014. The study is not meant to be descriptive, but conceptual. So what am I going to do here? I'm going to provide a surface overview. Obviously, in 20 minutes, a topic as complicated as Daesh cannot be completed. I'm going to look at the Islamic State's way of warfare from inception in the early 2000s to the present. It says late 2018. I meant late 2019. Specifically, the presentation will be about 3 key points. I'm going to start with a brief introduction of this concept of ways of warfare, which is used around a lot by military officers and grand strategists, but never essentially analyzed in an effective way. Then I'm going to establish 3 premises, and then provide, if I have the time, a quick and dirty surface overview of IS military evolution from 2003, the AMZ days, to the present. So what is a way of warfare? All countries have a way of warfare. We have to be careful that we do not get carried away and divided essentially into civilizational ways of warfare, which becomes very amorphous and not very descriptive and conceptual. Some people have written about the Western way of warfare versus the Eastern way of warfare, but the West includes many countries that have different ways of warfare, and so does the East. The concept of way of warfare without cultural baggage addresses twin issues of how and why a state or a non-state actor fights the way it does. And it incorporates within it the notions of war preparation and military effectiveness. It's been traditionally addressed by military historians and increasingly by strategic studies people like myself. Military historians write about, say, the Russian way of war, the German way of war, but when you look at their books, they're essentially a chronology of military history, but they don't conceptually analyze what it is a way of warfare is. Okay? Now, leading from this, we have many studies now of various countries' ways of warfare, but there are no studies of the ways of warfare of non-state actors, like LTTE, FARC, Hezbollah, Taliban, IS, etc., etc. And we need to have this. What are the factors that account for the emergence of ways of warfare? It's usually divided into two things, what I call structural factors and agency. Agency has to do with what human beings do to bring about a particular certain way of warfare. But a way of warfare is either constrained or you're provided with an opportunity by these structural factors that I've put up there. History, past experience, learning and emulation, ideology and jihad in the case of Islamic State, technology. What's the availability of technology? That's a structural factor. If you have very little technology, your power projection capability and of your way of warfare is constrained by technological poverty. If you have access to wider range of technology, that gives you greater power projection. The physical environment, geography and terrain, human environment, the demographic base and the human terrain mapping that both states and non-state actors do. IS mapped the human terrain of Iraq and Syria before it started subverting the states in both countries. The elite and leadership. What's the nature of the elite that runs either a state or a non-state actor and how it views warfare? And then you have to address what is the nature, the strengths and vulnerabilities of the enemies against which you apply your strengths against their weaknesses. Now, I have three premises. First, and this is as old as recorded human history, it was practiced and then became theory much later when insurgents began to wonder, how does the weak defeat the strong? In other words, the weak has a theory of victory. In brief, they have argued since time immemorial that the material is not the be-all, end-all of the balance of power between the strong and the weak. There is the ideological, cohesion, organizational, and discipline aspect that applies to military organizations throughout the world. Second, the strong is not without vulnerabilities, and the weak is not without strength. So in the West, we have what I call the very surface and basic conception of the balance of power. In the East, and also in Soviet Russia, they had the notion of the correlation of forces. And if you read Mao Zedong's theories of guerrilla war, he says every strong side has vulnerabilities. Every weak side has strengths. It's a dialectical interaction between the weak and the strong, where the weak applies their strengths to the weakness of the strong side, whereas the strong side is trying to apply their strengths against the weaknesses of the weak side. Islamic State is a learning organization. and its military thought and practice is eclectic. Okay? There might be no bid'ah in religion, but there is bid'ah that's innovation, in warfare, says Abu Bakr Naji, who wrote essentially the military manual for IS, called Idarat al-Tawahhush, the management of savagery. It borrows from all. If you read the guerrilla manual of a failed Saudi insurgent, Abdulaziz al-Mukrin, it's essentially a copy with Islamic flavor of Mao's book on guerrilla warfare. It learns from its own mistakes and from those of others, and it adapts and innovates. My third premise is that Islamic State is a functionally specialized hybrid organization with hybrid military capabilities. Now, the word hybrid has been bandied about, overused. A lot of people said it means nothing. A lot of people say it goes back to the past and so on. And a lot of people in the West argue that it's a Russian thing, where actually the Russians do not use the word hybrid warfare. They call it new generation warfare. Also, it's much deeper than this notion of hybrid warfare. The Russian view, if Alexander Vladimirov and V. Reznichenko are right, warfare is a social activity, a natural phenomenon. And here, there is a link between state conceptions of warfare and actually non-state actors. Because increasingly, or rather, from the time of Michael Collins in the IRA in 1919 to 21, the notion of fracturing your enemy's resilience and cohesion has become an aspect of non-state actor theory of war, basically attacking the society, especially multi-national, multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies, in order to fragment and fracture their resilience, cohesion, and discipline. But what is important in the concept of hybrid warfare here for non-state actor? The traditional view of People's Revolutionary War, as developed by people like Mao Zedong, Vo Niyuan, Giap, and others, is that you progress from guerrilla warfare through mobile warfare to regularity. And Abdul Haris Nasution in Indonesia. Guerrilla warfare is but an episode in your progression towards regularization. But with hybrid warfare entities like IS, you go up and down the spectrum of violence according to your weaknesses and the enemy's strengths and the environment. So ISIS began as a terrorist organization, became a guerrilla organization, then moved to semi-regularity, and then its regularity was crushed. It's moved back to guerrilla and terrorism, and what Carl Schmitt, a German author, called universal mobility. So now they're looking for other places to establish their presence beyond the Middle East. But that does not mean they have not given up harassing Iraq and Syria. They do it. They're murdering people on a continuously large scale as terrorists, not as insurgents or professional militaries. Will they move on to somewhere else? So let me, in the time remaining to me, look, just briefly. I don't have much time to go there. I've applied the concept to the early days of ISIS and the present. ISIS predecessors were terrorists, pure and simple. They murdered tens of thousands of Iraqis in the early years through targeted assassinations, suicide bombings, IEDs by the side of road, infiltrating not too combat-ready foreign fighters at that time, which is very different from now. They were inept at urban warfare, small unit warfare, managing the human terrain, securing the physical terrain. And remember, they were fighting also against the US Army, and I have personal experience of it because I was with the US military at that time, serving in Iraq 3 deployments, and we came across the predecessor and their rather limited repertoire of capabilities at that time. But they learned, they added, they emulated, and they became more lethal. Their military effectiveness in 2003 to around 2010 was low to mediocre, yet that low to mediocre effectiveness almost led to a US defeat in 2006 until there was a major debate on how the US will change, and then the implementation of Field Manual 3-22, which was the counterinsurgency campaign. IS was defeated, so we thought, in the years between 2008 and 2011. Then, like a phoenix from the ashes, it rises again with terrorist techniques to start as a building block to a higher level of capability. So they start with infiltration, undermine and suborn the anti-ISIS Sahwa movement, which was the anti-ISIS Iraqi insurgent movement, murdering 1,500 of them. They engage in what's known as the Breaking the Walls and Harvest campaign to undermine the Iraqi state. They established control of an illicit economy in Mosul, and they learned and adapted from past mistake, from some Ba'athist personnel that joined them, etc., etc. So by 2017, 2018, we call it the hybrid entity. It had regulars, mainly foreign, including Chechens, locals, Syrian and Iraqi, an elite unit called the Ingrimasi, assault, which is not suicide bombers, it's different. They even experimented with creating an armor unit. For those of you who are Sri Lankan, you know, it's similar, I think, if I may recall from my analysis of Ilam, similar to what in the LTT Charles Anthony tried to do with an armored capability. They created a battalion called Katibat al-Dabbabat, experimental tank battalion, to be able to create an armored capability, but they were a little bit inexperienced in the theory of combined arms. So they used it essentially as static artillery. And they also built artillery as well, and their most effective pieces were US M198 and Russian D-30 light howitzers, because they could follow their forces down when they went on their massive attacks. And SVBIEDs, self-propelled, some vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, which they developed into an industrial level in Mosul and Raqqa, but particularly Mosul, where they took off the second-hand car dealerships and workshops to do this. Drones, logistics. Now they were defeated in 2018, so they went back down the spectrum of violence to terrorism. And here, and I'll have to end here in a few minutes, but I needed to include their threat in Asia, and which makes sense because this is where we are, okay? The IS threat, and I'm not trying to be a Cassandra, but I've been trained to deal with worst case scenarios. The IS threat is spreading beyond Southwest Asia, AKA the Middle East, into wider Asia. I won't have time to talk about Central Asia or Xinjiang Uyghur region. I'm going to look at ISIS in South Asia and Southeast Asia if I have the time. Political Islamist movement, the violent version, not the political, non-violent version, in South Asia is a function of many factors, not just one factor. I've never believed there is one universal cause for anything. First, political and socioeconomic marginalization of lower class Muslims. Now, I'm not saying that poverty causes violence. It doesn't. Some of rich people have engaged in violence, and that has to do with identity politics. So it's a function of political and socioeconomic marginalization, one. It's a function of the struggle between IS and AQ in Asia as well. Each one is trying to up the ante against the other. If you want more details on this, read the statements of Ayman al-Zawahiri on the Al-Qaeda side versus Abu Baghdadi on the IS side on who's going to, going to succeed in this area. Thirdly, there's the issue, the millenarian issue of Ghazawat al-Hind, the battle for India, meaning larger in the sense, which is a big aspect for Ayman al-Zawahiri. Last but not least, the identity politics issue. Again, if you read Ayman al-Zawahiri and Adam Gadan of Al-Qaeda, they attack Muslim countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh for not being Muslim enough, and they attack non-Muslim countries which have minority Muslim populations for oppressing, as they see it, Muslims, and for generating populist movements like the Hindutva movement or the Bodu Bola Sena in Sri Lanka. Now, what is happening in Asia, and I'm going to have to conclude here, at the level of identity politics between Islamists and non-Islamists, has to do with identity politics in Hindu or Buddhist majoritarian countries versus Muslim minorities. But the identity politics also attacks Muslim states like Pakistan and Bangladesh, and also Muslim states in the Middle East. So for not being Muslim, for not being Islamic states. So essentially, if you see the rise of populism around the world and also focus on Asia, you're having essentially, in my argument, a struggle between various populisms, and unfortunately this has led, in my view, to the coming death of globalization as the world turns to identity politics, whether you're in the global north or global south. And on my last comment is, those of you who are interested in understanding some populism in Sri Lanka going back to the early years, it's fascinating to read Anagarika Dharmapala, a Buddhist nationalist, whose ideas were quite anti-globalist in that sense. So we're coming to full circle of seeing the rise of religious nationalism, which has been underestimated in IR theory in the West because it was regarded as a atavism that will disappear. You are seeing around the world, whether it's Islamist, Buddhist, Christian, or Hindu, a growth of populist politics which are clashing. Thank you very much.